Hey, Cross Park, welcome to your weekly leadership update. I have several things to bring to you this week. First, let's talk job changes. We've had a few staff changes recently. We told you that Vicki Lewis is moving to India and that Polly Thatch has taken her place. This week, Spencer and Courtney Johnson moved to Durham, and we are actively seeking for a replacement for our youth director. But I wanted to announce another change that most of you know that for much of the life of Cross Park, Trish Hardy has been our women's ministry director. She did it in the early days. She transitioned for several years to Wendy Schenk. She received the job back from Wendy. And then for the last 4 years, she has been in the paid position of women's ministry director. And of course, she's done an excellent job. We've always had a very strong women's ministry, in large part to the exceptionally gifted collection of women that we have. And Trish has done a great job working with those women. But recently Trish has felt called to move on to other things, that God's calling her elsewhere. And so we are making a transition. As Trish transitions out of the role, we are excited to announce that we are hiring Catherine Berenger. We have hired Catherine Berenger to be our new women's ministry director. So God's timing in this was excellent, as it always is, but we don't always get to see it. This time we saw it very clearly that Catherine and Fitz and the Berengers came to us during COVID, so a few years ago. And when she was starting to think about what God might be calling her to do was right about the time that Trish was starting to feel a call to transition out of the job. And so we are really excited to hire Catherine. We think she'll be an excellent fit for this job, and we look forward to the various ways that we'll continue to grow our ministry both to and with our women in the years to come. We are going to you'll get to meet Catherine Sunday morning. If you haven't met her before, we will have her up front and briefly share about what she's excited about in this job. And we look forward to all of you benefiting from Catherine's ministry in the months and years to come. Well, let's think for a second about Psalm 123, our psalm for this Sunday, and let's think about enemies in the Psalms. So our lament psalms are very often dealing with some sort of opposition. The most obvious and basic example of this is some sort of bad guy. There are bad guys, bad people who are opposing us. They're opposing God's ways. They're trying to cause me trouble. It's unpleasant. And what do we do about it? So oftentimes the psalmists are crying out to God, stop the bad guys, or help us with the bad guys. The bad guys are doing bad things, and it's causing us real trouble. And when we look at this, oftentimes this is one of the reasons that we are hesitant to know how to apply the Psalms, the lament Psalms, because we don't feel like we have enemies. We don't have lots of bad guys who are after us. And at one level, that is accurate. It's a sign that we live in a pretty comfortable situation, that we have some opposition, but relatively little intense opposition, not much true persecution. No one's trying to chase us or kill us simply because of what we believe or because we're standing up for God's ways. The danger here is that we conclude too much from that. We conclude, well, I don't have any real enemies, so these Psalms can't and don't apply to me. Just because no one's trying to knock me off or keep me from being the king of Israel, that somehow these laments aren't applicable. The truth is, as God's people, we are always opposed. We are opposed classically. The New Testament tells us that we are opposed by the flesh, the world, and the devil. And I want you to think for a minute with me about how these three relate to each other. The devil is sort of the normative sinner, the ultimate rebel, and he is always trying to lead people away from God's way. The world, as I've often described it, is like living on an inclined plane wearing roller skates. The whole system is slanted and created to keep you from God's ways and from true obedience. And then finally, our flesh. Our flesh is our sinful tendency, our weakness, and our flesh always opposes the truth and opposes the work of the Spirit. And so we have these three, flesh, world, and devil, who are working together in different ways to keep us from obedience. So you can see how there's always often going to be some combination of these, that the flesh and the world can inflame each other and make our temptation worse. The devil can use the world or our flesh to cause sin to be particularly appealing to us. So when we think about enemies in the Psalms, enemies in the Psalms of Lament, we should not simply say, I guess I don't have any enemies, so these don't apply to me. Nor maybe is it most helpful to ask, who are enemies, or do I even really have enemies? But rather, we should think about how, in fact, our enemies function. That we are always opposed, and that a good question is, who are my enemies right now? How are my flesh? How is the world? How is the devil? How am I being opposed in my desires for obedience, in my desires to love other people, in my efforts to pursue God's way? What is keeping me from doing that? And those, very likely, are your enemies. Now, we also don't want to miss the fact that, of course, you can also have people who are actively opposing you, persecuting you, pressuring you to do the wrong thing, to ignore God's way, to pursue independence from God. Of course, that is true, and you can rightly think about how to apply the lament psalms to the people who are doing bad things in your life. But as we do all of this, as we think about any of our enemies, we have to remember that Jesus has given us a victory. Jesus is victorious over death, over sin, over evil, over the devil. He's conquered the world. The New Testament tells us in many ways that Jesus is victorious. And so we don't have to live in abject fear of opposition. Rather, we have to ask, how does Jesus want to work in me and through me to stand up to the opposition, to stand firm while being opposed? And how does he want me to deal in a gospel way with this opposition? Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to pray for our enemies, and to heap kindness upon them. Those are hard to apply. Those feel very, very unnatural. And when you do, when you can identify people who seem like enemies, it's pretty hard to apply Jesus' saying, which is why we need the gospel. We need Jesus' model, but we also need his help. We need his spirit. We need his strength. We need his motivation to help us learn how to live selflessly and how to even love our enemies. So these are just some ways to think about how the enemies, the bad guys, the opposition that we see in the lament psalms that too often we dismiss as unrelatable, how actually, as we head into Psalm 123 this Sunday, you can think about these enemies in fresh ways, and you can ask, what is opposing me? What's keeping me from following God? And how do I find gospel means to deal with it? So, Sunday morning, we are in Psalm 123. I want you to now check out this poetic rewrite that I did for this week. Psalm 123. Eyes up ever as I walk, engaging you enthroned above all. Servants learn to train their gaze steadily on the one they serve. We take our cues from them, beholding God, waiting for what is needed. Give your people better than we deserve, as we've grown weary of contempt, unable to bear much more scathing scorn from the comfy and cocksure. Well, Cross Park, thank you so much. We do have a few things to remind you about this Sunday morning. We are transitioning to our summer schedule, which means that this service where we will have communion and introduce Catherine and hear Psalm 123 together, it will be at 9:30, not 10:30. Sunday school is over for the summer. This is our summer schedule, so that means service at 9:30. In addition to that, this Sunday, youth and families, we have a lunch event right after the service. We have pizza lunch by the pool. It's our summer youth kickoff event. So you're all invited to come, and we anticipate that we will be done by about 1:30. We can't promise that the swimming will be awesome or the weather will be great, but we will have at least a near the pool party right after the service until about 1:30 Sunday. Well, Cross Park, thank you for watching this video. We will see you Sunday morning at 9:30.